Permit me to introduce you to Sir Polydore de Keyser, hotelier, lawyer, Lord Mayor of the City of London for 1887 to 1888, and a man who, whilst presiding as a magistrate at the City of London's Guildhall Police Court, may well have come face to face with Jack the Ripper. In December 1889, several men appeared before him charged with having unmuzzled dogs on the streets of London, which was a direct contravention of an order that had been issued by the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Charles Warren, in May 1886, and which stated that all dogs on the streets of the metropolis that were not on a lead or properly muzzled would be considered as not under proper control. The owners of any such animals would be issued with a police summons for allowing a dog to be at large, contrary to the order of the Commissioner of Police. One of those thus charged was a young man in his mid-20s whose name was Aaron Kosminski. He had been spotted with an unmuzzled dog on Cheapside by Police Constable Borer, who had issued him with a summons to appear at the Guildhall Court. At his subsequent appearance, according to Lloyd's newspaper, there was some confusion over his actual name. Police Constable Borer said that he had given it as Aaron Kosminski, but one of his brothers who attended court with him said that this was wrong, as his name was Abrahams. After some discussion, his brother admitted that, although they found it more convenient to go by the name of Abrahams, his name was in fact Kosminski. The defendant claimed that the dog was not his. Nonetheless, Sir Polydore de Keyser imposed a fine of 10 shillings and costs, which, according to Lloyd's weekly newspaper, Kosminski refused to pay, as it was the Jewish Sabbath, and he did not think it right to pay money on the Sabbath. Sir Polydore de Keyser gave him till Monday to pay the fine. Following that brief appearance in the spotlight, Aaron Kosminski faded once more into obscurity. However, over the next few years, things would go on behind the scenes that would not become universally known for almost 100 years, and when knowledge of them did eventually emerge into the public domain, the name of Aaron Kosminski would move right up the list of potential contenders for the mantle of history's most notorious criminal. And it all started in 1894, when the Sun newspaper launched a series of articles in which it claimed, "We know the Christian name and surname of Jack the Ripper. We know his present habitation. Our representatives have seen him, and we have in our possession a morass of declarations, documents, and other proofs which prove his identity." Although the articles didn't actually name him, it is apparent that the person being referred to was Thomas Cutbush, who was at the time an inmate at Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. The Sun's articles led the then Chief Constable at Scotland Yard, Sir Melville Macnaghten, to compile a memorandum in which he gave the names of 3 men, any one of whom, he claimed, would have been more likely than Cutbush to have committed this series of murders. The second name on this list was Kosminski, about whom Macnaghten had this to say: "A Polish Jew, and resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. Macnaghten's report would not be made public for many decades, and so the name of Kosminski was not publicly linked to the Jack the Ripper murders in 1894. It should also be noted that Macnaghten himself favoured the first name on the list, M.J. Druitt, as his prime suspect in the case. But although Macnaghten's memorandum had been filed away in 1894, at least one Victorian author appears to have been given access to it, and 4 years later that author would share details of Macnaghten's 3 suspects with his readers, albeit he didn't actually name them. In 1898, Macnaghten's friend, the popular author and military historian, Major Arthur Griffiths, published Mysteries of Police and Crime, part of which dealt with the Whitechapel murders. Whilst researching the book, Griffiths almost certainly consulted Macnaghten about the fate of the perpetrator of the atrocities, and from the following passage it would appear that Macnaghten gave him access to the report that he had compiled in 1894. Griffiths wrote that, "The outside public may think that the identity of that later miscreant, Jack the Ripper, was never revealed. So far as absolute knowledge goes, this is undoubtedly true. But the police, after the last murder, had brought their investigations to the point of strongly suspecting several persons, all of them known to be homicidal lunatics, and against 3 of these they held very plausible and reasonable grounds of suspicion. Concerning 2 of them, the case was weak, although it was based on certain suggestive facts. One was a Polish Jew, a known lunatic who was at large in the district of Whitechapel at the time of the murder, and who, having developed homicidal tendencies, was afterwards confined in an asylum. There can be little doubt that the person being referred to by Griffiths in this passage is Macnaghten's Kosminski, and that the source of the information was therefore Macnaghten himself. Interestingly, 2 other high-ranking police officers, who were more closely associated with the investigation into the crimes than Macnaghten was, and who had a more in-depth knowledge of the evidence and any suspects, did, so it would later be revealed, consider Kosminski to be their prime suspect. In 1910, Sir Robert Anderson published his memoirs, which were titled The Lighter Side of My Official Life. Anderson became the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and head of the Criminal Investigation Department in early September 1888, and as such he was one of the highest-ranking officers to have direct involvement with the Jack the Ripper case. However, no sooner had he taken up his post than his doctor ordered him to take time off to recover from nervous exhaustion, and so, on the 8th of September, he left London for a recuperative break in Switzerland, not returning until after the 30th of September, the night of the double event when Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were murdered within an hour of each other. Anderson would go on to enjoy a long police career before retiring in May 1901, whereupon he devoted himself to writing and lecturing. Over the next few years, he would state several times in both his writings and his lectures that Jack the Ripper had been confined within an asylum. Then, in 1910, he published The Lighter Side of My Official Life, part of which inevitably dealt with the Whitechapel murders. On page 137 of his book, Anderson wrote that one did not need to be a Sherlock Holmes to discover that the criminal was a sexual maniac of a virulent type, that he was living in the immediate vicinity of the scenes of the murders, and that, if he was not living absolutely alone, his people knew of his guilt and refused to give him up to justice. During my absence abroad, the police had made a house-to-house search for him, investigating the case of every man in the district whose circumstances were such that he could go and come and get rid of his bloodstains in secret. And the conclusion we came to was that he and his people were certain low-class Polish Jews, for it is a remarkable fact that people of that class in the East End will not give up one of their number to Gentile justice. On page 138, readers learnt that, contrary to the popular perception that the police had been unable to catch Jack the Ripper, the murderer had, in fact, been known to the police. Anderson wrote, and the result proved that our diagnosis was right on every point. For I may say at once that undiscovered murders are rare in London, and the Jack the Ripper crimes are not within that category. And if the police here had powers such as the French police possess, the murderer would have been brought to justice. Scotland Yard can boast that not even the subordinate officers of the department will tell tales out of school, and it would ill become me to violate the unwritten rule of the service. So I will only add here that the Jack the Ripper letter, which is preserved in the Police Museum at New Scotland Yard, is the creation of an enterprising London journalist. Having regard to the interest attaching to this case, I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer and of the pressman who wrote the letter above referred to. But no public benefit would result from such a course, and the traditions of my old department would suffer. I will merely add that the only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him, but he refused to give evidence against him. In saying that he was a Polish Jew, I am merely stating a definitely ascertained fact, and my words are meant to specify race, not religion, for it would outrage all religious sentiment to talk of the religion of a loathsome creature whose utterly unmentionable vices reduced him to a lower level than that of the brute. These were explosive revelations. Sir Robert Anderson, one of the highest-ranking police officers on the Jack the Ripper case, stating on the record that it was an ascertained fact that Jack the Ripper was a low-class Polish Jew, and that the only witness who had had a good view of the murderer immediately identified the police's prime suspect as the man he had seen when confronted with him. Unfortunately, Anderson did not name either the suspect or the witness. As far as the identity of the witness goes, two people, as far as we know, may have got a good view of the face of the murderer. One was Israel Schwartz, who claimed to have seen Elizabeth Stride being attacked by a man in Berners Street at 12:45 a.m. on the morning of the 30th of September, close to the spot where her body was found 15 minutes later, and the other was Joseph Lavender, who at 1:35 a.m. that same morning saw Catherine Eddowes talking with a man by an entrance to Mitre Square 10 minutes before her body was found in the square's southwest corner. Obviously, since Anderson did not name the witness, it is pointless speculating on which, if either of those two men, the witness was. Equally frustrating is the fact that Anderson teased his readers that the killer's identity was definitely ascertained, but did not actually reveal who he was. One of those readers was an ex-colleague of Anderson's by the name of Donald Sutherland Swanson, a former chief inspector at Scotland Yard, and the man who, following Anderson's departure for Switzerland, was given overall charge of the police investigation into the Whitechapel murders. He would remain at the helm until the 8th of October, when Anderson returned to his post. Thereafter, Swanson became the second most senior officer with direct responsibility for the case, and it was his job to read and assess all the information that the Jack the Ripper investigation was yielding. Thus he built up an unrivaled knowledge of the case, being the one man who had access to every strand of data to do with the hunt for Jack the Ripper. In other words, he had what we would call the big picture. Of course, given his involvement with so many aspects of the case, Swanson's opinion on who the perpetrator of the crimes might have been would carry an awful lot of weight. However, Swanson was extremely tight-lipped about any personal theories he may have held. According to an article in the Police Review, which was published on the 15th of May 1896, he viewed his work as decidedly Secret Service and was opposed to public reminiscences. Consequently, Donald Sutherland Swanson was one of the few officers connected with the case who never made any public pronouncements on his involvement, and what we do know of his thoughts on the hunt for Jack the Ripper comes from what others said about him. For example, on the 7th of May 1895, the Pall Mall Gazette began an article with the following tantalizing paragraph. Since the cessation of the Whitechapel murders, there has been no lack of theories accounting for the disappearance of the author of those crimes, Jack the Ripper, as he is called, in consequence of a series of letters so signed, purporting, rightly or wrongly, to come from the murderer. The theory entitled to the most respect, because it was presumably based upon the best knowledge, was that of Chief Inspector Swanson, the officer who was associated with the investigation of all the murders, and Mr. Swanson believed the crimes to be the work of a man who is now dead. So, as Donald Sutherland Swanson perused the recollections of his old colleague, much of what Anderson had written would have been familiar to him, and unbeknown to anyone else at the time, Swanson couldn't resist adding his own reminiscences to his copy of Anderson's book, and he made several annotations in the margins and on the end sheet. This marginalia would go undiscovered until long after his death in 1924. Indeed, it wasn't until the early 1980s that what Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson had known about the case was unearthed by his descendants, and his revelations were, to say the least, intriguing. At the foot of page 138 in his copy of Anderson's book, under the passage in which Anderson had mentioned that the only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer had unhesitatingly identified their suspect but had refused to give evidence against him, Swanson had penciled the following explanatory note. Because the suspect was also a Jew, and also because his evidence would convict the suspect, and witness would be the means of the murderer being hanged, which he did not wish to be left on his mind. DSS. Swanson appears to have ruminated on Anderson's musings, and he had later returned to this passage and had underlined Anderson's claim that the witness had identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him. He had also added in the left margin, and after this identification, which suspect knew, no other murders of this kind took place in London. Swanson then expanded further on the book's end paper. Continuing from page 138, after the suspect had been identified at the seaside home, where he had been sent by us with difficulty in order to subject him to identification, and he knew he was identified. On suspect's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by police, City CID, by day and night. In a very short time, the suspect, with his hands tied behind his back, he went to Stepney Workhouse and then to Colney Hatch, and died shortly afterwards. Kosminski was the suspect. DSS. So Swanson had identified Anderson's suspect as Kosminski, and since this Kosminski had been sent to Colney Hatch Lunatic Asylum, there can be little doubt that this was the same Kosminski to whom Macnaghten had referred in 1894. But who was he? Combing the records of Colney Hatch Asylum in the 1980s, researcher and author Martin Fido located an inmate by the name of Aaron Kosminski, who had been sent to the asylum in February 1891. 3 years later, in April 1894, he was transferred to Leasden Asylum on the outskirts of Abbots Langley in Hertfordshire, and he would remain an inmate there until his death on the 24th of March 1919. Since he is the only Kosminski in the Colney Hatch records, his name was soon linked to Swanson's suspect, and today many people are convinced that Swanson's Kosminski was Aaron. So, what do we know about him? Aaron Mordecai Kosminski was born in Poland in September 1865, the youngest son of 7 children. On the outbreak of the Jewish persecutions of the early 1880s, the family fled to London, where they settled in the East End. They adopted the surname Abrahams, although, as can be seen from Aaron's court appearance before Sir Polydore de Keyser in December 1889, he continued to use his birth surname, Kosminski. Other than that, very little is known about his time in London until on the 12th of July 1890 he was admitted to Mile End Old Town Workhouse Infirmary, his illness being given as 2 years insane. On this occasion, Aaron's stay lasted just 3 days, and he was discharged into the care of his brother, whose address was given as 16 Greenfield Street. 7 months later, on the 4th of February 1891, he was again taken to the Mile End Old Town Workhouse Infirmary, from where, 3 days later, he was transferred to Colney Hatch Asylum. On his record of admission, his occupation is given as hairdresser, his age is given as 26, and it is stated that his first attack of insanity had occurred when he was 25. It is also stated that the duration of his existing attack was 6 months, to which someone has added in red 6 years. In addition, the record also states that on admission the cause of his insanity is unknown, to which was later added self-abuse in red. Significantly, the entry for whether dangerous to others has the response no, which one would think would hardly have been the case if there was any suspicion that he was Jack the Ripper. His record of admission provides more about his illness. He declares that he is guided and his movements altogether controlled by an instinct that informs his mind. He says that he knows the movements of all mankind. He refuses food from others because he is told to do so, and he eats out of the gutter for the same reason. Jacob Cohen, who in 1891 was in business with Aaron's brother-in-law, Wolfe Abrahams, at 51 Carter Lane, St. Paul's, provided a little more information, stating that he goes about the streets and picks up bits of bread out of the gutter and eats them. He drinks water from the tap, and he refuses food at the hands of others. He took up a knife and threatened the life of his sister. He is very dirty and will not be washed. He has not attempted any kind of work for years. And so, Aaron Mordecai Kosminski began his stay at Colney Hatch Asylum, and thereafter the records about him become somewhat sparse, and those that do exist are mostly concerned with his being incoherent, apathetic, and sometimes excitable. He comes across as anything but homicidal, the only mention of any violence on his part, apart from his having threatened his sister with a knife, being an entry dated the 9th of January 1892, which describes him as at times excited and violent, and which says that a few days ago he took up a chair and attempted to strike the charge attendant. Following his transfer to Leavesden Asylum in 1894, mentions of him became few and far between, and although he was described from time to time as having been excitable and troublesome, he was certainly not violent. So what was the evidence that led Anderson and Swanson to accuse him of having been Jack the Ripper? Well, the honest reply to that question is, there isn't any, or, to be exact, none of it has survived. If he was high up on the list of police suspects, then the police must have had a file on him, but that has either been lost or destroyed. And it has to be said that there is a strong possibility that Aaron is not the man to whom Swanson and Macnaghten were referring. Macnaghten opined that his Kosminski became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He also stated that he had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, whereas nothing that we know about Aaron Kosminski suggests that this was true in his case. There is also nothing in the few records we have of him to suggest that Aaron Kosminski had any homicidal tendencies, let alone strong ones. In addition, he was removed to a lunatic asylum in February 1891, not March 1889, which Macnaghten says was the case with his Kosminski. Anderson's Polish Jew may well be the Kosminski that Macnaghten was referring to, but Anderson gives us very little information about him, and the case for the guilt of his suspect is based solely on the fact that a witness who had got a good look at the face of the murderer had unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him. That this identification actually did occur is confirmed by the Swanson marginalia, and Swanson revealed that it happened at a place called the Seaside Home, the location of which has never been definitely ascertained. So the case ultimately rests on the revelations made by Swanson in his copy of Anderson's autobiography. And it has to be remembered that Swanson did not, as is often claimed, name Aaron Kosminski as having been Jack the Ripper. He merely stated that someone with the name Kosminski was the suspect. It wasn't until the 1980s that Martin Fido linked Swanson's Kosminski to Aaron Kosminski, and the elephant in the room as far as Aaron's having been Swanson's Kosminski is that Aaron didn't die shortly after being admitted to the asylum, as Swanson says was the case with his suspect. In fact, Aaron lived for another 28 years, not dying until 1919. It is also worth noting that Martin Fido himself was not convinced that Aaron was the man being referred to by Swanson. Anderson and Swanson were the two most senior police officers with direct involvement in the Whitechapel murders investigation, and they would certainly have known the evidence against all the major suspects. If they thought that the evidence against a man named Kosminski was stronger than that against any other suspect, then Kosminski has to be a prime contender for the mantle of having been Jack the Ripper. But the question still remains, who is the Kosminski that they are referring to? Aaron fits the bill in that he certainly lived in the area with his family and was sent to Colney Hatch Asylum. But thereafter, the similarities between him and Swanson's or Macnaghten's Kosminski are at the best tenuous, at worst non-existent. Aaron didn't die shortly after being admitted to the asylum, and unless there is an undiscovered file somewhere that is yet to be unearthed, none of the records suggest that he was homicidal or even particularly violent. But haven't they now proved that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper using DNA, I hear you ask? There have certainly been claims that DNA samples taken from a shawl, which was said to have been found alongside the body of the Mitre Square victim, Catherine Eddowes, proved a positive match for samples of their DNA provided by descendants of Catherine Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski. Unfortunately, the scientific community were quick to point out serious flaws in the methodology used to obtain the results, whilst the provenance of the shawls having belonged to Catherine Eddowes, or actually being a shawl at all for that matter, is questionable. The City of London Police, in whose jurisdiction Catherine Eddowes was murdered, made a thorough and detailed inventory of the items that were found on and around her body in Mitre Square, and nothing matching the fabric that is purported to be her shawl is reported as having been present at the scene. I will be doing a more detailed video on the so-called shawl at a future date, but for now, let's just say that neither DNA nor provenance have validated the shawl as the holy grail that proves the guilt of Aaron Kosminski beyond any reasonable doubt. And thus, as has happened with so many suspects, we are left with a case that, at first glance, appears to be extremely strong, but which begins to unravel the more you tug at the threads. Anderson and Swanson were experienced and senior officers, and they would have had access to all the evidence to do with the Whitechapel murders, and they were therefore able to base their suspicions on the facts that were available at the time of the murders, and not on speculation and opinion, which is often the case with theories put forward today. Swanson, as the officer who read and assessed all the information on the investigation, would probably have known more about it than Anderson. In fact, he probably knew more about it than anyone else, and it would appear that long after his retirement from the Metropolitan Police, he remained convinced that somebody named Kosminski, who was sent to Colney Hatch Asylum, had been the perpetrator of history's most infamous murder spree, and therefore Kosminski was, so it would appear, the prime suspect for the mantle of having been Jack the Ripper. But unless we can uncover the evidence that Sir Robert Anderson and Chief Inspector Donald Sutherland Swanson were privy to, we cannot say with any degree of certainty whether Swanson's Kosminski was Aaron Mordecai Kosminski, or whether Aaron was nothing more than an innocent asylum inmate who, thanks to several unfortunate coincidences, has found himself falsely maligned as one of history's most notorious monsters. Do you think that Aaron Kosminski was Jack the Ripper, or do you favour another suspect? Cast your vote on our online poll, whowasjack.com. Thanks for watching, I hope you've enjoyed the video, and please be sure to hit the subscribe button for updates on other videos on Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murders.